Good afternoon and good evening, everyone in Europe. I'm Julia Friedlander, the C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council. We're pleased to co-host today with the Eurasia Group to discuss the preliminary deal reached late last year between the US and EU to replace the steel aluminum tariffs with a TRQ and a carbon mechanism. We want to use this as a jumping off point to discuss if creative arrangements like this one can be applied to other countries affected by the Trump-era tariffs, address the real question of overcapacity and dumping, and perhaps how this could lay the groundwork for a broader transatlantic carbon deal. We can also talk a bit about the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, given the expertise we have here today. I'm just opening today, so I'd just like to say a quick welcome to the panelists. We have Amanda Blunt, who's the Counsel for Legal Affairs and Trade at General Motors, Greta Peisch, General Counsel at the Office of the United States Trade Representative, Rupert Schlegelmilch, the Director responsible for the United States at the Directorate General for Trade and the European Commission, Clete Willems, who's a non-resident senior fellow with us at the Geoeconomic Center and also partner at Aiken Gump. Moderating, we're welcoming Jonathan Lang, Director for Trade and Supply Chains at the Eurasia Group, and our very own Moehr. Please enjoy this conversation and engage with the Q&A function. This always works best when we make this as interactive as possible. So without further ado, I'll just pass this on over to you, John.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks to our panelists and participants for joining us today virtually for this terrific discussion of next steps for Section 232 tariffs, transatlantic coordination on addressing issues of steel and aluminum subsidies and dumping, as well as industry decarbonization efforts. As Julia mentioned, my name is John Lang. I serve as Director for Trade and Supply Chain at Eurasia Group. Eurasia Group, for those who may not be familiar, is a geopolitical risk and advisory and consulting firm where we partner with industry to understand and address uncertainties in the geopolitical landscape and how they drive business challenges. And needless to say, the status of transatlantic relations and evolving trade policy priorities continue to be areas of great interest. So we're really excited to be partnering with the Atlantic Council to discuss this important topic today. But with that, let me turn it over to Ole to jump into the discussion.
Thanks so much, John, and Julia as well. As Julia said, my name is Ole Moehr. I'm a fellow at the Geoeconomic Center, and thank you all again for joining us today. I'd like to remind everybody, please submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We really want this to be as interactive as possible. However, in the first part of the session, we'll turn to the panelists for brief statements to kick us off. So let's jump in. Greta and Rupert, I'd like to start with you. Can you walk us through and provide insight from your perspective on the process for reaching agreement on the 232 TRQ conversion, and how do the US and the EU envision carrying this momentum forward to build this new framework focused both on fighting trade distortion as well as climate change, and to really address the root causes of dumping, subsidization, as well as promoting industry decarbonization? Greta, let me start with you.
Sure, and thank you for having me, and I very much welcome this conversation and the questions and insights of everybody. It's an important initiative and one we're really excited about. To address your question, the process for getting here, it was a long one. It was a detailed one, and really dug into the two underlying issues that we have here. One, global steel overcapacity, as well as carbon intensity. On the first issue, as we know, that's a long-standing, intractable problem that the world has had. In 2000, there were over 100 US steel companies and 136,000 people employed in the industry in the United States. And since that time, employment has dropped by 40%. And that's a really stark story of the impact of largely non-market practices in China. And even though that problem is centered in China, it has a global impact. When we were looking at this and this administration coming in and what to do and what was the next step, we really wanted to come to a solution that takes into account that global nature of that impact, and the alignment that we have with the European Union and other parties. And so we had a long conversation, really detailed about this very issue, what the impact is on trade between the United States and the EU, between us and the rest of the world. Also recognizing that this is a really ambitious project that we're now embarking on, and we needed something in the interim to replace or bridge to where we ultimately want to go, which is the global arrangement. And that is the TRQ discussion and outcome that we announced late last year. So we really do see that as an interim step to get to where we ultimately want to go, which is the global arrangement, to take into account both of those important issues in our trade with the EU and ultimately with other parties.
Thank you so much, Greta. And over to you, Rupert.
Yes, thank you, Ole, and thanks for having us here. I think it's indeed a very complex, interesting topic. I'm very pleased to be here to discuss it with all of you. And I can seamlessly follow on to what Greta just said. We agree actually on the problem definition, if you want. We have a huge issue in the sector, in the steel sector. The European industry has been downsizing massively the last 20 years. And we need to do something about the overcapacity. We also need, and that's the parallel track, to do something about the carbon footprint. 10% of the global emissions come from steel and aluminum production. That is huge. So we're also committed to actually do something about this other challenge. Now, we didn't agree with some of the measures which the United States had taken. You're fully aware of that. We still thought that these tariffs that we then faced were not justified. And we now have a solution, not an agreement, because we'd never agreed formally. That's very important for the lawyers in the room. We didn't have an agreement on the TRQs. We had a US measure to open TRQs, and we took our rebalancing away in order to make space for a constructive way forward, which is now to see what can actually be done to solve the problem long term. Because what we really want is to have everybody playing fair on steel and trade in steel and aluminum, producing without subsidies which distort the marketplace or other government-sponsored action, investment. And we also want to, at the same time, use the fact that we have to decarbonize, which actually makes, if you wish, those who decarbonize even less competitive, because that has a cost, obviously. Yeah? So we have to also address the issue of what happens in the marketplace if we are ambitious on climate. And all of that will come together now in this new project, which I think has a lot of promise, because we will hopefully be able to help ourselves to do the decarbonization efforts without facing, if you wish, immediately carbon leakage, people moving elsewhere where they don't have the costs which are necessarily implied for decarbonization. On the EU side, we have already things in place to avoid some of this. We have an ETS, an emissions trading system. We're now working on a border adjustment mechanism to reflect the carbon price that we are paying internally for the imported goods, which is a proposal, it's not yet done. So we have been thinking in the same direction, but we have not thought about it so far. Now we're doing that, about the kind of agreement we're trying to negotiate here with our US partners, and potentially, as we have agreed, with like-minded countries.
Thank you, Rupert. That's really helpful remarks. I'll turn it over to John for next question.
Thanks, Ole. And let me, in turn, turn it to Amanda for her opening comments. But a quick question. So the Biden administration has emphasized the pursuit of a foreign policy for the middle class, with a particular eye to prioritizing the interests of domestic manufacturing labor in its trade negotiations. So with that lens, how is a steel-intensive industry such as autos interpreting the changes to 232 tariffs? And what do you see as opportunities as the Biden administration seeks to broaden its outreach on 232 to other like-minded allies, including, for example, the UK and Japan?
Thanks, John. The short answer is we welcome this development and we welcome further collaboration and coordination with other stakeholders. We are a truly global operation, and it's no secret us and other manufacturers have been challenged in recent years with both price changes and availability challenges for our key inputs. At the same time, we've also been setting ambitious sustainability goals and working internally and with our suppliers and with other industry leaders in this space on ways to achieve those sustainability goals and achieve them in a way that's inclusive, which also goes back to cost of input and price. So I think it's a welcome development at a critical juncture, and we would like to see further work done in this space to see how we can collaborate as an industry, cross-sector, with government partners on ways to reduce carbon intensity of our key inputs while maintaining a cost-effectiveness, cost-efficient way to produce, for us, electric vehicles for the future.
Thanks, Amanda. And next to Clete, we'd love to hear your thoughts, on the course of negotiations, both as someone familiar with the discussions which drove the initial application of 232 tariffs, and someone now with an outside perspective working with a range of clients on these issues. Where do you see the areas of transatlantic cooperation, particularly on common overcapacity issues?
Sure. Thanks, John, for the question, and I'm happy to be here. I have to start my remarks by congratulating Greta and Rupert and their respective governments. As John alluded to, I was in the middle of this during the Trump administration. I had helped run the Section 232 interagency process on behalf of the National Security Council. And one of the things I proposed at that point in time was a TRQ with the EU and with other US allies. Needless to say, President Trump didn't decide to go in that direction. So you all have literally succeeded where I failed. And so, seriously, kudos to you. The reason I like the TRQ is I think it achieves a couple different things. It does allow historical trade flows to continue, which mitigates a price impact. I think it also mitigates the challenges in the relationship. And there were tough times between the US and the EU when we move forward with this. And so I think the TRQ helps solve that. It also has a surge protector. It's basically built in. So as we all work on excess capacity issues, we can make sure that there isn't transshipment and other kinds of dislocations that end up flooding the US market. So I think that's a nice aspect to it. And of course, I think it's great that you all have set up this process on joint action to focus on excess capacity, as well as to try to get ahead of what could be another major irritant, which is around climate and carbon border mechanisms. So John, what I want to do then before I turn it back to you is I think, again, I'm effusive. I think it's great. But let me give you guys a couple suggestions on where I think we need to go from here, how to make this more effective. And the first suggestion is we've got to get other countries in this mix as soon as possible. This is important for a lot of reasons. I think there's still a question of pricing in the US, and Amanda can maybe speak to this better than I can. But I was looking at prices this morning. The US price is still almost double what it is in Europe. It's about 3 times what it is in China. And that puts our companies at a competitive disadvantage. So getting more countries in the mix will help with that problem. Also, if the solution against China and others who engage in this kind of bad behavior is going to be effective, we need everyone rowing in the same direction. So if I were the Biden administration, I were the Europeans, I would expedite as quickly as possible getting Japan and the UK into the fold. I'd look at the others. There were over 30 who applied to us during the Trump administration looking for alternative solutions. I try to bring them in quickly. And then even for some of the ones where we have deals like Korea and Brazil, I try to rationalize it and make it more consistent with what you all are doing here. Second, I think the fixation for domestic legal purposes for the US on capacity utilization isn't really the right metric. And I think if you look at the numbers, our goal when we adopted this in the Trump administration was to get to 80%. We're at 82% right now. but we were at 76% last January, a year ago. So what that tells you is that these numbers are fluctuating somewhat irrespective of whether or not we have trade measures in place. There might be other things going on. And so I think continuing to focus on capacity utilization above all else doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't really reflect the role of trade on steel. I think you actually have to look more closely at the different types of steel production in the United States. Look at the mini mills versus the integrated mills. Look at legacy costs. And that is a better way to sort of guarantee the overall health of the industry. The third thing is really needs to be joint action against China. I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the discussion, but we actually all need to take action against China together if it's going to work. And I know that's tough for some of US allies, maybe or maybe not tough for Europe. We can talk about that, but I think that's important. Fourth, I do think we need to transition in the US away from the national security justification. I think it has been more detrimental than helpful. I think it undermines us at the WTO. I think it undermines our ability to tell other countries not to use that as an excuse. I like that we're now more focused on climate and excess capacity. I think that's better. And we have to figure out how to sort of put that in place in the US. And then finally, and I'll stop here, I do think let's not stop here in the US, in the EU, and figuring out ways to work together. You know, this should be the start of a productive relationship. Using the TTC, we got to get at other problems before they crop up as well. So thank you for the opportunity to give some opening remarks.
Thanks, Clete. You pretty much have already covered all of the questions that John and I thought about beforehand. So I think that's very helpful. And let me turn it back to Greta, but first say, please submit your questions via the Q&A function. We already got 2 really good ones, but please add more to that. And then, you know, kind of picking up where Clete left and talking about the need to add countries to this emerging mechanism. Greta, could you talk a little bit more about the efforts as the Biden administration is reaching out to like-minded allies and partners? We know about the conversation with Japan and UK, where that stands and what sort of the next steps are.
Sure, thanks. I would first say, you know, it made a lot of sense to start with the EU, which is, as Clete mentioned, we have a lot of things going on, a lot of positive trade agenda that we wanted to get to and to remove some of the obstacles to that. But we also, as Rupert mentioned, share many of the same concerns about overcapacity and the impact in the sector. We have broadly similar levels of carbon intensity, share concerns about climate change. It really makes sense as a good place to start in that partnership for talking about the global arrangement. A couple comments on that, on adding countries. I think there's some have-tos. We have to maintain high ambition on both addressing overcapacity, as Clete mentioned, as well as addressing carbon intensity. And we have to get the global arrangement done. And both of these would favor keeping a small group, at least initially, as we set up and construct the architecture of a global arrangement. However, a third have-to is we have to open it up to other countries, and we have to get a greater community of like-mindeds on the same page to be really effective. And so that pulls obviously in the other direction. And so I think it's going to be a balance between those. I think we do see this as a vehicle to have the conversation with countries about taking stronger action with respect to China. And that is, these are both the carbon piece and the overcapacity piece, which means in our minds, in large part, standing up to China are really critically important. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of venues in the Global Steel Forum and other places where we've gathered information, had important conversations, understood the problem on a more granular level, but that's kind of as far as we've taken it. And we view the global arrangement as a way to push it one step further And so the United States are going to have really high standards, and we want to push countries to rise to that standard in order to be a part of the arrangement and forge a path forward together.
Thanks so much,
Thanks, Greta.
Sorry, John, I was just going to also turn it over to Rupert to respond just on the on the efforts to sort of multilateralize the agreement and get the EU position, as well as sort of lessons from, Greta mentioned Global Forum on steel excess capacity. How do we do better in the future?
Yeah. Well, maybe let me start by saying it's not called the Global Forum for nothing. It's not called the Bilateral Forum. So obviously the intention is to turn this into something which makes sense. And we all know that issues like subsidies, you cannot really tackle bilaterally. I mean, you can have the best arrangement you want, but there are so many players in these markets, distorting measures being used, which are just basically we're not able to control them, I think, unless we have a critical mass of countries in the end who join. Now, what that means for the process is a little bit open, because like Greta, I would agree that we have to be sure that there is a alignment, a like-mindedness in the ambition of this. The Global Forum that we have in the OECD on excess capacity was useful as a forum to exchange data and to make some progress in understanding the issues, but it was not good for finding solutions, because people had just too diverse interests. And you saw that, not only China, but also other countries in the end, when they saw this becoming serious, either didn't show up anymore, or at least they refused to participate on some of the parts of the work. So we'll have to be mindful of that and start, and there we would agree to carefully see what will be the, if you wish, the entry criteria before just taking the decision to open it up. That discussion, I think we will have with our American friends, hopefully rather soon, and exactly how to frame that. We're also discussing that internally in our own preparatory efforts now. And we have a number of options here, which we'll discuss, and then see how quickly this will be a broader discussion.
Thanks, Rupert. And looking at some of the questions we have coming in, you talked a little bit about opportunities and fora for engagement on these topics. Obviously, we have TTC coming up, and it's great to see a willingness for the U.S. and EU to work together on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, for example. Frankly, these policies and potential, the potential for their application, divergence, and approach really has the potential to be a major new irritant in transatlantic relationship. How are new bilateral mechanisms like the TTC, for example, to get ahead of other potential disputes, for example, digital policies like the Digital Markets and Digital Services Act? Clete, I don't know if you want to take that, and maybe if Greta or Rupert have thoughts as well.
Sure, and let me quickly respond to a point Greta made, which is, I am here advocating for greater inclusiveness in terms of adding countries to this, but I don't think that we should water down our ambition. I think we can be clear that what the U.S. and EU intend to do is big and it's bold, but give others the option that if they're willing to come along with us, the water's warm and let them in. And I think that really is the key, is just to say, look, this is where we're going. We hope you can come along with us. And if they're willing to do it, let's see what they can do. On the question you asked, John, I mean, I do think, a lot of folks in the business community are very pleased, again, with the broad US-EU cooperative efforts and with the TTC. I mean, it's an exciting thing. It's another kind of example of where, when I was in the Trump administration, we tried to set up a joint mechanism like that, and it didn't really get off the ground. So I hope you guys will be more successful. But what I think there is some concern about is that there are some really huge issues that are popping up in the relationship, and it's not clear if the TTC is going to deal with them. So putting aside steel and aluminum and climate for a second, I think, as John alluded to, I mean, the Digital Marketing Act, the Digital Services Act, this is an area where both the US and the EU are both looking at greater regulation of technology companies. And I think it's really tough for the US to understand why Europe would plow ahead without sort of listening to our feedback and thinking about how to coordinate. You know, and Sherrod Brown from Ohio made really great points on this, which is basically, you know, even if we're frustrated, you know, in the Democratic Senate with technology companies, you know, Europe shouldn't be going after them without coordinating with us. And I think there's also concern about some of the specifics, and I won't belabor it, but I think just some of the way that it's appears to be designed where it really falls heavily on US companies, not on European companies, and maybe not even on Chinese companies, sort of reminds us a little bit of digital services taxes, and also I think raises some national security concerns about, you know, why are Chinese companies why is there a lower standard being applied to them than American ones? So I'll just throw that out there as one, I think, issue that a lot of folks in industry are wondering, hey, can the TTC deal with this too?
Greta or Rupert, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts or comments on that.
I'll let Greta go first. I have a few comments. We are moving a little bit away from the subject matter as a sort of using the 232 discussions as a template, and the TTC, the template for further cooperation and avoiding issues. And I think I couldn't agree more. And the Trade and Tech Council actually talks quite a lot about the issues already. We have working groups which talk about platform regulation, about also social control via technology, responsibility, and so on, competition rules. So there is a discussion taking place on these issues. I think the divergence that we had in the past on these issues has greatly diminished, because there seems to be a sense on both sides of the Atlantic that regulation is needed. Now, you can always argue whether what kind of regulation is needed and how far do you want to go and how effective is all of that. But there is no longer a theological divide that don't touch the technology companies and the platforms, and don't think about what you can do about hate speech or fake news, or what you can do about the competitive effects of economy of scales, which make the market entry very difficult, just to give you a few examples. So the TTC is exactly, and it's actually fulfilling that function to allow dedicated discussions on these issues without necessarily getting into each other legislative processes, which, you know, everybody's guarding very jealously. That's true for the US and for the EU. But there is an open dialogue going on these issues, and it does have an impact in the discussions which are still ongoing on these measures, I can assure you.
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, we, since the start of the administration, we've taken head on and resolved or moved forward in a number of our issues with the EU. That isn't to say we don't still have areas of disagreement, and this being one of them. But I think the track record of that cooperation, of working through the issues, of setting up the TTC, and really just having a lot of avenues to discuss and attempt to work out these issues can only be to the benefit of addressing these areas where we have concerns.
Thank you, Greta. Let me try to bring Amanda in as well. You know, assuming that this global arrangement will actually make a significant impact. Looking at the, you know, the importance of the Chinese consumer market to the, you know, for example, auto industry, including General Motors, do you have any concerns that, you know, a company like GM or others might be caught in that coordinated transatlantic effort? And, you know, if it proves to be really successful at addressing the issue of dumping?
Well, we're really focused on increasingly a secure, sustainable, resilient, in certain instances, localized supply chain and inputs. So we take a long-term view And these issues are one of many considerations when we're making decisions about supply arrangements and about manufacturing decisions. We do, of course, have an important market in China, but there's, like Greta alluded to, any number of issues with any given trading partner at any time. And so, we welcome this development and are optimistic about what it could potentially achieve as it broadens and progresses. And that's kind of where our focus is in terms of supporting this effort right now.
Thank you. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Ole. As Washington and Brussels discuss what, a decarbonization type construct or mechanism might look like for industry, a question to Greta and others who would like to weigh in, is the Biden administration considering, challenges the political calendar might present to, the U.S. domestic development side of whatever that mechanism might look like? Is that in any way advising that calendar or creating impediments to or limitations on, what that construct might look like in the, in the longer term as you negotiate with international parties?
Yeah, so the calendar I'm most focused on is the 2-year timeline we've given ourselves to negotiate this, honestly. From first principles, we don't want to be limited in how we think this should operate. So I think we want to start from, a blank slate and say, to achieve these dual purposes and incentivize decarbonization around the world and address overcapacity, what would this look like? We need to certainly, as a political matter, bring all of our stakeholders along, bring the Hill along, bring our industry along, bring workers along in what that would look like. And we may run into restrictions over time, but I think as we address those, we want to come from a place of knowing what we want it to look like. So I think the answer is maybe in short, no, we're not restraining ourselves now by a political calendar and what those options may be.
I could just jump in here real quick, John, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead, Clete.
I want to just share an observation about sort of this climate arrangement and what I think is going to remain a challenge for the U.S. And it's really, how do you proceed without some sort of clear domestic price on carbon? And I think, we just need to throw that on the table and say that is going to make it difficult to, I think, come up with sort of a global arrangement here. There may be sort of WTO challenges if you don't have that. There's also this question of sort of how do you compare different, measures that we take to promote, clean steel or clean other industries versus other countries. Now, I will be very realistic and say, a lot of Republicans on the Hill, probably Senator Manchin, don't love this idea. But I don't know how we don't sort of bring that into it and we don't really try to come up with some sort of legislative solution that deals with that. And I'll just say, as someone who works with a lot of folks in the business community, there may be greater receptiveness to this kinds of idea than otherwise anticipated, because one thing it does bring is certainty, right? And I think what people are really worried about is a lot of uncertainty about how things will be adjusted at the border. And so again, like I said, I'm a political realist, maybe this never happens in the US Congress in any foreseeable future, but just coming up with something that gives people more certainty about how it would be implemented, I think is going to be important to do as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Clete, and thanks, Greta. Back to you, Ole.
Yeah, thanks, Clete, for jumping in. Open some of the questions here in the Q&A section as well. One from Stephen Overly, again for Greta and Rupert, specific question on, do you expect the excess capacity agreement to directly address China's industrial subsidies. Is that one of the goals? You touched on that a little bit already, but just to elaborate on that. Rupert, can I turn to you?
Yeah, well, well, I think the effect, if you wish, if you want to address overcapacity in a good way, I think you have to find a way to address the subsidization in the sector. And that will be, again, one of the challenges, because we might not want to touch on every conceivable subsidy, in particular if it's linked to the decarbonization. But the kind of subsidies that we're seeing are not those. They're basically capacity enhancing, cheap credit, cheap land, purchasing arrangements, and so on. So that kind of subsidy, if it addresses or if it links with overcapacity, will certainly be part of the discussion. You have to have a way. You have to have some kind of regime, if you wish, on the subsidy that we don't have today, because as you all know, what we have today, especially in the WTO, let alone the bilateral field, is very patchy. Yeah, but we'll not call it, I don't think we're going to call it we're addressing China subsidies. I think we will address types of issues or behavior of subsidies which create overcapacity no matter where they happen, because we don't have an interest to exclude maybe others who are following some of the practices in other state-controlled economies. Don't forget that we have other major producers of steel, or at least important producer of steel, also in Europe's backyard, if you wish, that might be or might not be covered by these practices. And so obviously subsidies is part of the problem, if you want a short answer.
Thanks, Rupert. Greta, do you want to jump in on this as well?
I mean, I generally agree with Rupert. It's two sides of a coin, or, the cause and effect. And also absolutely agree that, it isn't just China. It is other countries where we see subsidies and other practices that are leading to overcapacity, which also, of course, leads to more carbon in the atmosphere if we have more production than we need. And so, yeah, I think that absolutely.
Thanks, Rupert and Greta. And Amanda, let me bring you back in with a quick question. So, going back to kind of some of the multilateral or bilateral fora where these issues can be hashed out, particularly the TTC. Obviously, there's a TTC meeting coming up in a few months. What would industry or GM like to see, progress on in the TTC? Are there, particular things that industry would consider wins in that conversation, or where would you like to see that progress?
I think GM and industry more broadly is happy to see the engagement. First of all, I know it's early and they're still developing kind of the various working groups and agenda items. But we just are glad that this is up and running, and also glad that they're working on a process to involve interested stakeholders like our company and others to try to collaborate in that way, and we'll welcome further development of that process. So I'd say we're kind of an early and active cheerleader of the TTC, and we are always eager to lend expertise and feedback where it may be helpful, particularly on creative new initiatives that will be success or failure stories based on their administrability, including for industry. And so we're always happy to collaborate. And that applies as well in the border carbon adjustment realm that we already raised, on the steel collaboration that will come, and of course in the TTC.
Thanks, Amanda. Talking about the TTC, I want to bring in Fran Burwell's question here. It's a little bit, it's related, but on a slightly different subject. And she asked sort of, where are we in developing US-EU cooperation on export controls? We may now be looking at export controls on technology vis-a-vis Russia. And her understanding is that TTC only had some initial scoping discussions in that area. What are the obstacles to more cooperation there? Rupert, if I can turn to you first.
Well, I think France's description is slightly not ambitious enough. I mean, there's more than initial scoping discussions going on export controls, first of all, because obviously that is a key issue for better cooperation, if you wish. I think the obstacles are also very clear. One of them is there are quite sensitive national security issues involved, which make the sharing of information, the common threats, risk assessment, and so on, a little bit more delicate than in other areas. On the EU side, we have a unique setup because it's the only working group where we actually have member states involved because of the national security prerogatives, where the EU export control tools which exist rely very heavily on also cooperation with the member states because we are not a major security actor in the EU as such, as you know. But there is a lot of improvement in also aligning in the EU, which is one of the issues that always has been important also for the US. They would like to have a good counterpart which is coherent. And that takes to some extent place via the international arrangements, Wassenaar and so on, which we have. But we also now have in the TTC, I think, much more discussion on the EU level, beyond scoping, what exactly does it take, and how can we be more effective to align, where possible, the actions in order to not undermine each other's export control action. I think that is actually new in a way, that we never had that kind of good cooperation. How far it will go, we'll have to see, because obviously there has been reservations, in particular also on the US side, to share a lot of information on upcoming measures. But I think we're on the right track.
Can I jump in here really quick? I promise I'll be brief, and I know this is another topic that deviates a little bit from the core theme of the conversation, but 30 seconds, I want to underscore how critical this is to U.S. industry and to U.S. effectiveness with their export control measures. And I'm thinking about China in particular. And if I could just say it bluntly, if the U.S. takes unilateral measures that inhibits our ability to sell certain products to China, and other countries don't do it, if Europe doesn't do it, if Japan doesn't do it, if Korea doesn't do it, all that happens is the Chinese switch their purchasing from us to others, and we end up hurting U.S. competitiveness without hurting China's national security ambitions. So I think the export controls is in addition to the steel and aluminum things, one of the top 2 or 3 things that the TTC needs to be doing. And I would love it, Rupert, if we can get more aligned on this stuff. I'll leave it to Greta to make sure you guys are getting the information you need from us. But really, I just want to underscore how important this one is.
Thanks. And Clete, sticking with you for just a moment, getting back to some of what you mentioned in your opening comments on kind of what the correct, more quantitative metrics would be for, assessment of some of these mechanisms around 232. You talked a little bit about capacity utilization and pricing. Could you expand upon that a little bit more?
Sure. And this goes back to sort of the initial 232 decision under the Trump administration, and ultimately what the lawyers at the Office of Legal Counsel said is that we needed to have a clear metric in our executive order that justified the decision to take these measures, and it had to be some sort of metric of health of the industry. And at that time, what we came up with was capacity utilization. How much are our plants running, and that was considered to be sort of the best metric for health of the industry. And I think what we've seen over time, as I mentioned in my remarks, is that whether or not we had tariffs on 20, or well, I guess it's a large amount, right? Is that the tariffs initially led to a spike in capacity utilization. So it showed that as an initial matter, there was some direct relationship there. But then over time, I think we've seen less correlation between the data on capacity utilization and the question of how many countries are paying tariffs versus how many are in a TRQ mechanism. And like I said, in early 2021, it was at 76%, and now it's at almost 81, 82%. And so it suggests that opening this up, making this more liberal, if capacity utilization is your metric, may not be that harmful at this point in time. But it also shows that this number is fluctuating wildly for reasons that have nothing to do with tariffs, and may have more to do with domestic demand. And so that's why I just don't think this is necessarily the right metric. And I think you need to look more closely, at the U.S. industry and say, okay, our mini mills and companies who have mini mills and who don't have the same legacy costs as some of the integrated producers, I mean, they're churning out record profits. They're getting set. Right now I was looking at the price today, the steel benchmarker price, and right now it's $17.50 a metric ton of hot rolled steel in the U.S. It's $6.36 in China, and it's $10.40 in Europe. So the question becomes, how healthy is our industry actually right now? And if we're getting those kinds of prices, should we more broadly revisit the 232 regime, or at the very least, should we be more aggressive in sort of bringing more countries in so we can start these global conversations about climate and excess capacity? And then really, instead of focusing on the friction between us, focus on how do we get you to take joint action against China, which is where we've pivoted with the EU. So I wanted to share some more specific data points for people to think about, but I think those are all relevant to how the US proceeds in the future.
Thanks so much, Clete. Really helpful again. I just want to give Greta a chance if she would like to jump in on this and respond.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think, it's true that capacity utilization is only one metric. I think it is a useful metric to use with other data about what's going on and what the impact has been and what the health of the industry is. I mean, ideally, we'd like to see more production come back online, new production come back online to kind of get us where we think we should be under, true market-oriented conditions. I agree with Clete. There's a lot going on, especially in the last couple of years with supply chain and shipping difficulties. So I think we are in a unique place right now where the backlog in demand, restrictions in supply, and that mismatch have taken quite a while in this industry as well as in many other sectors to normalize and come back. And certainly those price differences that Clete cited, they can't all be because of the tariff, which is a 25% tariff that doesn't apply to Canada, it doesn't apply to Mexico, and we have exclusions for many countries that take into account products that aren't made here, that in some areas and in product areas are significant. And so there's obviously something else going on. And I think it is, we're constantly looking at it. We're looking at trade flows as well. What are companies saying about investments they're going to be making? What kind of certainty do they have for the future? So it is quite complex. And all of these data pieces are important and important in understanding, I think for us, our agreements that we conclude, whether they're interim agreements or looking for something more durable, like the global arrangement, they need to capture not only where we are today, which I think in our assessment is still a pretty unique point in the economic story of the steel sector, but also where we're going to be in the future, thinking about what will China and other countries be doing, what kind of investments and subsidies will they be providing as these incentives to go green intensify worldwide. And take all of this into account to construct something that is really going to be meaningful in achieving our goals.
Thanks, Greta. And let me turn to Amanda. If you have any additional thoughts, once again from kind of a steel-heavy industry perspective, particularly on price benchmarking.
It's a tough problem to tackle, but there's already a lot of work being done. GM is a founding member of the Climate Leadership Council, and we work with a lot of different environmental organizations, other companies across sector, and we are really tackling these issues of administrability. A lot of this work can be plugged into different scenarios, different solutions. So, it kind of originates from the border carbon adjustment discussion, but as we've alluded to here, it can have applications in other circumstances. It's one of those discussions where once you resolve one question, 10 other pop up along the way. But there's some really technical work being done in terms of benchmarks and defaults, and how do you accurately account for carbon emissions and intensity in the price that you would use. And it's really important, interesting technical work that's already being done by industry, like-minded companies on their own, voluntary basis right now. And part of it's to prepare for potential implementation of something like the CBAM or a U.S. domestic price on carbon, and to be helpful in, again, coming up with something administrable and that's going to work. So we're trying to lead in that space. We're going to continue to lead. And again, I think it's an opportunity for public-private partnership because it is very technical work and very challenging problems to tackle, but important.
Thanks, Amanda. Let me turn it back to you.
Thanks, John. Just kind of picking up where Amanda left off, I think there are many concerns about the EU's sort of proposed CBAM mechanism around how compatible is that with existing WTO rules. Just wanted to sort of turn it back to Rupert on that. Have there already been discussions on that relating to the global arrangement as well, or is that not a concern right now?
Yeah, thanks, Ole. Maybe the first thing I would like to say is to see that I'm very happy to hear what Amanda said about the work that is ongoing to get head around this issue on how do you actually measure the carbon content, the carbon footprint, because that is one of the key questions if you want to have a certain fairness, if you wish, in the marketplace. It will also come up in our discussions on the global steel arrangement, because if you want to have a carbon free, or if you want to have a carbon sort of angle to trade rules, you have to actually know what you're talking about. Where is the carbon, and how do you measure the carbon embedded directly or indirectly in a product? And this is where it goes back to CBAM that you mentioned, Ole. CBAM will have to solve that issue, because it will, work on the basis of certificates that the importer has to buy, which actually is linked to the carbon content of the imported product. And that methodology doesn't actually exist right now. And it's certainly not one that is like the, if you wish, methodology. And we are working on that, and we will do that in parallel as we discuss here in this context of the GSA, of the global arrangement, how to get to grips to that. And I'd also like to go back, if you allow me 20 more seconds, on what Clete has said on the absence of a carbon price. Now, there are many ways, there's more than one way to measure, to have a carbon price. You can have it per industry, you can have it per emission ton of CO2, or whatever you come up with, but there has to be some kind of methodology. That's the point. And if there is no carbon price, which is administered in one way or the other, except maybe on some state level in the US, then we will have to find a way to make sure that we can all apply a global agreement, because it has to have some sort of benchmark, if you wish. Whichever it is, I don't know, but it's a valid comment, and we will have to deal with it.
Thank you, Rupert. Just want to give Clete as well as Greta a chance to chime in on this as well, if they'd like to.
I agree. I'm glad Rupert agrees with me. I mean, look, it's all I'll say is it's politically incredibly difficult in the United States, and so I don't mean to sort of throw out ideas that are not doable. But it just, I think in terms of sort of presenting international legitimacy, making sure that there's certainty, we need to try to figure out, is that or is that not a realistic possibility? And my point is, look, there's companies, there's members of Congress who are going to be all over the map on this, but I think we need to at least have that conversation, see what's possible, and then go from there.
Greta, would you like to jump in as well?
Sure. I agree with Rupert. I mean, there's a lot of technical questions and work to be done, and a lot of design questions and potential options out there about how to structure this. And so that's the project that we're starting to undertake now.
Thank you. And then, just to kind of take it to a little bit, 30,000 feet higher level to kind of cap off our conversation, I just wanted to, raise the issue of sort of managed trade, right? So it's sort of a common refrain, if you ask economists, industry groups, both fueled by China phase one, as well as now the TRQ deal, that the US, EU, also other advanced economies are increasingly relying on this managed trade model. Greta, you really emphasized earlier, this is supposed to be an interim to get to a different place. But I just wanted to ask, all the panelists basically the question, are voluntary export restraints, TRQs, and, thus effectively stifled companies, that's the only realistic way forward to reduce issues or address issues such as overcapacity, and somewhat counterintuitively promote more market-oriented conditions? Starting again with you, Greta, and then I'd like everyone to chime in.
Sure. As I said, this is an interim measure. It is aimed to restore historic trade flows from the EU. I would point out that the default from the United States perspective is not a free market. It is one where China undertakes industrial targeting and planning. It directs the economic actors in its economy to make decisions that aren't based on market conditions. And so that is a form of managed trade. It is a managed trade that's chosen by another country. And so we are trying to correct for that, right? And to do it in a way that, of course, there's always going to be imperfections, because it is not purely allowing the market to drive. But I think we have, decided as an administration and as a country that we can't just accept somebody else's market terms that they're imposing on the rest of the world. So I think for now, while we try to negotiate and then expand out the global arrangement, we are using these measures to try as closely as we can mirror what would have been the market conditions that our sector would face.
Thank you. And Rupert, Clete, Amanda as well, if you'd like to chime in the last 2 minutes.
Well, I'll be very brief. I think we don't like managed trade, and we don't necessarily like TRQs and anything, but we also we are realistic. This was a solution which helps the economic case of resuming historical trade. We lost 50%. Don't forget, we lost 50% of our trade, steel export to the US. We had to do something about this. I don't want to qualify what that is. I think we all have a clear, and there I really agree with Greta. We have to find a way to restore the market conditions. And if you wish, all the anti-dumping, anti-subsidy that we are actually already applying to especially China's steel, let's be honest, you could also say that's in a way managing the trade, but we're defending ourselves. So what we're trying to do, without justifying anything, because we believe the 232 tariffs which should not have hit Europe, as Clete has said, there might have been a better way to deal with it, but that's what under the bridge. But we have to find solutions. Let's look ahead and try to find a solution for this. And that will include new instruments, new rules, new tools, but not necessarily managed trade.
Yeah, and I'll jump in next and say, look, from the perspective of market economies like the US and the EU, the end goal always should be, to the extent possible, free markets and free trade. That's what we want. But I completely agree with Greta And we were in a situation, and we still are in a situation, where China is behaving incredibly unfairly. And I don't want to say it's just China. I mean, there are other countries who are heavily subsidizing their industries, who are engaging in transshipment and other kinds of unfair practices. And the normal tools weren't working to change that behavior. Negotiations at the Global Steel Forum weren't working to change that behavior. So action was needed. And so again, I said at the outset, I sort of didn't like exactly where President Trump landed on this. My preference would have been to do a 301 targeted at the countries engaging in unfair practices, and then getting the other countries into more of a managed trade situation to deal with that. I still think you can sort of back your way into that through the 232. But again, I'll go back to where I started, which is it really only works if everyone is doing it together. And so we need all of the countries who are willing to adhere to these free market principles to all then be taking that joint action and isolating China and other unfair trade practices. And once we do that, I think that will create an incentive for them to actually change. And so, again, the goal is free trade, but sometimes you need to take a different approach to get to that end goal. And I think that's what you're seeing here.
Yeah, I'll just briefly end with, on the broad spectrum of potential trade tools, most restrictive to most flexible, TRQs somewhere in between for us, better than a quota, I guess, in certain scenarios. But we also understand the policy goals. So again, supportive of this arrangement, whether it's interim, as Greta noted, or becomes a different version in the near future.
Thank you all. Over to Julia.
Thank you, everyone. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today and sharing their expertise and their time talking about a bunch of moving targets, some of which are sensitive. So thank you for sharing as much as you have. Clearly, this is the tip of the iceberg on a broader set of transatlantic issues that both the Atlantic Council and the Eurasia Group will be working on. I firmly believe that 2022 is the year of better regulation. At least that's the way I'm starting out my January. So again, thank you for all who have joined us today, and enjoy your afternoon. And for those in Europe, your evening. Bye-bye.